So, hi. So what's the idea of this class? I'm going to talk for 2 to max 3 hours. I really hope it won't be 3. In any case, I won't do that in one go without a break. So I'll aim for 40 minutes, max 50, do a break, and reconvene, and then we'll see if we need to do a second break or not. But in any case, I'm here to talk to you today about electricity, in particular the electricity system, a little bit about how it works, and especially electricity markets. If you're studying energy politics or energy law, I think it's very useful, and I think the two professors agree that you also understand something about, okay, one of the big parts of our overall energy system is electricity, of course. Lots of stuff is electricity in our modern society. And so I want to give you an idea today. That's sort of goal number 1, how this whole electricity thing works. A little bit of technicalities as well, but I won't go full engineer, don't worry. But and then especially how does this work economically? Like electricity is a product, it gets traded, sold and bought, of course. But there's all kinds of interesting complexity there that I'll try to convey to you today. So this is my outline for the class. It's very simple. I'm going to start by telling you about a machine, a very fascinating machine, the electricity system basically, which can be looked at as one machine. We have a part about, okay, what is the role of electricity in sort of the overall energy transition, right? I'm assuming you're all aware that we're societally in some kind of an evolution where we're transitioning towards cleaner energy, and electricity plays a very important part in that. So that's what I'm going to talk about secondly. And then probably the majority of my time will be spent on the third part, which is electricity markets, trying to explain to you how those work. But starting with this machine. So if you think about what might be the most amazing, sophisticated, crazy machine that humans have ever built, then one of the ideas that may come to mind is this machine. That's the Large Hadron Collider. It's a 20-kilometer underground tunnel in the border of France and Switzerland where they do physics experiments. It's a pretty crazy thing. As you can see, those are humans, so you can see how big that's just one little part of that 20-kilometer thing. So that's a good candidate for one of the craziest machines. Here's sort of a visualization of what that machine does. Right? It's totally underground. Then you have, of course, another cool machine, the International Space Station. It's been up there for decades. There are permanently a few astronauts there, right? They come and they go. They usually only stay for a few months, but there's always people in there, and this is spinning around the world non-stop. It's one of those amazing things that also got created by a collaboration between several countries, including the US and Russia and Europe, or European countries. And that's definitely a candidate. But of course, you already sense that what I'm getting at here is that the correct answer to what the most incredible machine is that humanity has built so far in our entire history is basically the electricity system. Because if you really think about what this is, it's sort of one huge interconnected thing. In the case of Europe, it spans the whole continent. Cables, very large cables, the ones you see on the top left, right, with the big towers, you know those are called transmission grids. They are kind of the highways of the electricity system. And you also have many cables in the ground, in the streets, of course, and so it's sort of this incredible network. Everything's interconnected from the north of Finland to the south of Portugal. It's basically one interconnected thing, and in that sense, it's one machine. And across this whole network, there are like thousands of power plants, and now also tens of thousands of wind farms and solar farms. And of course, this is all connected to millions and millions of power plugs, out of which all of the electricity then flows in every building, right? All of those cities, all of those beautiful lights, etc. It's all basically one huge interconnected thing. And of course, it's not one person or one organization managing this full thing, but it is in a sense one thing, and it's a pretty incredible thing. The fact that it's incredible can also obviously be seen from space, right? You see super clearly where in the world people have lots of electricity available to them. Unfortunately, much less the case in the still more developing parts of the world. But you can very clearly see the eastern half of the US and all of Europe, of course, India as well. Here's not a picture from space, but instead just a visualization for all of Europe of all of these electricity highways, right? So these are only the very big cables. And if you look at it again, you know, as I said, from Finland to Portugal, it's one super huge, super amazing thing. And if you look at it super simplified, which is also kind of useful to do, it would look something like this, right? Each country is just a dot, and the countries are also connected with each other with electricity lines. And why do I show this? Because it just makes very clear that some countries are very much in the middle of Europe, like Germany. Germany is the country with most neighboring countries, right? It has countries all around it, and so Germany is super interconnected with many other countries, and so it can also rely on helping each other out and trading with so many, let's say, partners around itself. Whereas a country like Portugal has to do it to a larger degree on its own. It's not literally an island, but in terms of electricity, it only has a connection with Spain. And so Portugal has to arrange their electricity business more like 90% on their own, let's say, because they can't rely on exchanging electricity with every country around them like Germany can or Belgium can. Now, today in our society, it's basically unimaginable, right? To not have electricity. We're so completely used to it that we don't even pay attention to it anymore, right? It's just a completely obvious thing that this is always available 24/7, completely reliably, more or less, right? When's the last time we had a blackout where we really didn't have any electricity for hours? I don't even remember one, to be honest. Maybe some of you from other countries do, but it's in any case in Europe extremely rare. And but you know, let's not forget that this took many decades to develop, right? This didn't come just overnight. We in fact started. If you look at the US, for example, how it evolved throughout the years. It started with just like this super small grid in urban areas, so just in New York, etc., in Chicago, in cities. And then they started noticing, I'm talking about the 1900s, and then they started noticing like, hey, maybe if we interconnect two cities, that sort of helps us both, because then it becomes easier for the both of us to have reliable electricity service. If we're a bigger network together, that just helps. And so that just kept going, and today, yeah, in the US, there's also to some degree this super big interconnected system like in Europe, although the coasts of the US are less interconnected than you just saw the European map. That's really all over the place. One big web. In the US, that's not quite there yet, but still getting there. So that's the machine. That's part one already of my class finished. So you see, okay, that's one very quick part, and then it will go slower and slower. So the role of electricity, let's talk about that. And before we do, we need to quickly ask ourselves a question, namely what the difference is between electricity and energy, right? These are two terms used in the media often interchangeably as if it's the same thing. But think about it for a moment, like what's the difference? You, of course, all know electricity. You use electricity for so many different devices in your daily life. It's hard to even keep count of them, for all the different things that use electricity. And it's not only in our own daily lives. I mean, in our homes, all of these devices. It's lots of other stuff, of course, in the economy, public transport like trains, electricity. All of the robots in all of the factories, electricity, all of the lights in every street, right? Making sure it's not completely dark outside, data centers, etc., etc. So that's very clear, okay? We all know what it is. We all know that we use it for lots of stuff. But then ask yourself the question: is all of this? Is that also our full energy use, or is there other stuff that we also can call energy consumption, but that's not electricity? You can probably start thinking about some stuff, right? And these are some of the easy and important ones. The energy consumption that is not electricity. We, or at least some people, cook with a gas stove, right? That just burns natural gas. That's definitely energy consumption, but it's not electricity, right? It's burning gas. We fuel our cars with gasoline, not electricity, but a major part of our energy consumption, right? Some people heat their homes with a wood stove. That's energy consumption. And the national statistics from Eurostat or whatever about a country's energy consumption, also the wooden blocks people throw in their stoves are there's sort of calculations made about how many people heat like that and how much wood blocks do they throw in their fire. And sort of those things are also included in energy statistics. Most homes in Flanders and in many other countries in Europe, somewhere in the corner have a machine like this on the wall. It's called a gas boiler. It's to heat your home. Also burns natural gas, and it's also a major part of our electricity consumption, heating of our energy consumption. Sorry, making the same mistake. See, it's easy to do. So a major part of our energy consumption, but it's not electricity. And in the bottom left corner, you see steel making, just as one example of a huge and very energy consuming industrial activity that is today basically entirely fueled by things like cokes and coal and in some cases natural gas, basically fossil fuels but not electricity, but still huge part of energy consumption. Now, there's something that is super important to know about this whole energy transition thing that we're doing as a society over many years, and that is that we are basically going to start doing more and more things with electricity that we did not yet do with electricity before. That's called electrification. And some people even go as far as to say we should electrify everything. You don't necessarily need to take that super like literally as if really everything can be done with electricity, but still it's a sort of an easy slogan to remember. Electrify everything. In the energy transition, one of the big jobs we have is to do more stuff with electricity. Why? Because electricity can be produced, at least, at least using some technologies, it can be produced in a way that doesn't emit any greenhouse gases. And so moving stuff to electricity and then making the electricity in a clean way is a very good way to reduce emissions and address climate change. So what does that mean, electrifying everything concretely? Well, let's go back to the examples I just gave about stuff that is not electricity: cooking, driving, heating, industry. Cooking, you can move from burning gas to using an induction stove, right? Driving, you can drive electrically. I mean, you can also do public transport and biking, of course, but to the degree that there are still cars, and there's going to still be cars in the future, right? At least to some degree, right? Even if we move a bit more to other stuff. The cars that are still there, we would like them to be electric. We will always need to heat our homes and other buildings like offices. We can move from burning gas to using a heat pump, which consumes electricity to heat buildings. And even in steel making, with the example I just gave, it is possible to use, and I'm sorry, the dot that's of me being filmed is sort of hiding it, but even steel production can be moved to another technology to produce steel that just consumes lots and lots of electricity and no longer the fossil fuels. That's not yet being done because those investments are, I mean, it's hundreds of millions and it's new technology, and so right, we may have to wait a while, and maybe it even doesn't go that way in the steel sector, but it's possible in theory, and so we need to electrify lots of stuff. So basically then, if you want to summarize the whole energy transition into two big things that need to happen over some number of years, and it's already ongoing, of course, right? We don't have to begin anymore. We already began. Okay, it's ongoing. We'll take a few more years, decades even maybe. And so the two big things basically that need to happen are that we shift to towards electricity, as I just explained. So doing more and more stuff with electricity, but then also, and that's of course the other part of the transition, which is, okay, this production of electricity, that needs to itself become greener as well. can be done a number of ways. Renewables are, in any case, always a part of it, right? You can talk about nuclear or other stuff, but it's always going to be the case that there will be much more renewable energy. That's sort of unstoppable now, as I will show you in a moment. So you can say broadly, we're moving towards way more renewable energy, and we are going to move towards doing way more with electricity that we didn't do with electricity before. So there's the two big transitions that we need to do. And it's interesting to realize, by the way, that if our total energy consumption, which includes everything, not only electricity, but all the other stuff as well that I mentioned, right? If you put that into a number, it's what the red circle shows here. So we have some huge amount of energy consumption, right? All energy consumption, electricity and other stuff. And when we move in the future towards a new energy system as a society, what we're going to do is we're going to shrink our total energy consumption. We're going to use less energy in that sense. That's called energy efficiency, right? Which is something we also strive for. But at the same time, we're going to hugely increase the amount of electricity we will be consuming. If we do way more and more and more with electricity, the amount of electricity we consume as a society is going to boom, right? That's self-evident. But still, it is true at the same time that our total energy consumption decreases. And one of the ways, like, okay, you may ask yourself, how can that be? But one easy example is, for example, cars. Fossil-fueled cars, as we know them, when you put 100 units of energy in the tank, right? All energy can be measured in the same units. That's something the physicists have come up with. If you put 100 units of energy in the tank of a car, right? The energy that's sort of theoretically available in the fuel that's in the tank. If you then drive your car, you burn the fuel. 2/3 of all of the energy in the fuel is lost to heat and friction. And in fact, even slightly less than 1/3 actually goes towards moving the car. Whereas if you move to the electric way of doing this particular thing, electric cars, if you put 100 units of energy into the battery and you then drive, something like 95% of it goes to actually driving and 5% of the energy is lost. That's just physics. It's because if you make an engine that goes boom all the time and it's burning and making explosions, right? That's what a fossil car is. There's just tons of energy that gets lost that way. So if you just transition this particular thing from a fossil car to an electric car, you sharply reduce the total amount of energy you use just because you waste so much less energy. Right? Fossil fuel ways of doing things are typically super wasteful. They waste a lot of energy. And the electricity, sort of electrified technologies, they waste a lot less. So that's how this sort of double transition is possible. Now, let's take a look through a few graphs how it's going with this transition. And in particular, I want to point our attention now to how it's going in terms of the transition to renewables. We're building more windmills and more solar panels over the years, right? That's increasing. I hope you all are at least vaguely aware of that, but let's look at some numbers. How fast are we going? How much are we building, right? Is this moving slow or fast? Is this stagnating? Or are we going backwards? Let's find out. So a nice point to start out is to look at some prediction that people made now more than 30 years ago. In 1993, some of the smartest engineers, and these are really the best of the best, they are the engineers for the biggest, most wealthy, richest electric energy companies. They are called utilities in Germany. And they were tasked with trying to find out through deep technical research, okay, this was the early 90s, so okay, they were starting to say, hey, maybe in the future we will build some windmills and solar panels, and will that even work? And so they put their best engineers on it, they did their best possible research, and they came with the conclusion that's on the screen. They said, okay, renewables, very nice, solar, wind, even hydropower, building a dam somewhere, holding back some water and then letting it flow to produce electricity. Those things, they said, it's completely impossible technically, they said, to have that be more than 4% of your total power supply. And they gave reasons, and they said, okay, it's too unpredictable, and the wind blows and then it stops, or the sun shines and it stops and then there's a cloud, and this is way too unstable and it won't work, right? Maybe a few percent, but more than that's impossible. And they even added to it, even in the long term, we're really sure, even very long term, it's not going to happen, few percent max. Does anybody want to shout out a guess, or maybe even what the share was of renewables in the total electricity production that took place in Germany last year? So there was a lot of electricity produced in Germany last year from different technologies. Which part of it, which percentage came from renewables last year, 2024? Shout something. Doesn't matter. Make a guess. I won't be... Any guess? 12. 50? 50? Okay. I'll stop there. I can already tell you the second person won, because last year 63% of all the electricity produced in Germany came from renewables. You have to know the term renewables here is covering a broad load. It's not only wind and solar. It includes a bit of hydro. It also includes a bit of what's called biomass. So if you basically, from somewhere, like there's maybe a factory making wood panels and they have leftover wood chips, and they compress those wood chips into little wooden blocks of sawdust, basically, and people use that to heat a building. That's also renewable, because you can grow more trees, so it's in that sense, it's not a finite resource. So, but that's also in there, to be fair, but still 63%, I mean, it's a lot. Huh? Let's look instead of Germany, let's take a look now at the whole world. So at the global scale, this is what's happening to solar power. Each bar tells you how much brand new solar capacity was built and basically added to the world system that year. And so you can see that how much new solar panels we are building and installing globally. Every year that number is bigger. So each year we install even more than we installed the last year. So it's not the cumulative capacity of the world that's growing. This is how much we install in each individual year. And it's exponential, as you can see. And it's for a large part, it's China, which is something you should know. But it's not only China. And so last year we built 600 gigawatts of solar capacity. To give you an idea, if one nuclear power plant is turned on 100% producing electricity, the amount of power that comes out of that machine is about 1 gigawatt. That's what a gigawatt is. And so 600 gigawatts of solar was built last year globally. So, I mean, it of course, that doesn't quite, I mean, it of course doesn't produce 600 gigawatts 24/7 because the sun doesn't shine 24/7. So that's an important difference with a nuclear plant. But still, the capacities are just, it's going exponential, and it's really crazy, solar, what is happening there. Let's look at wind. Globally, wind is a little bit less of an exponential curve, but still last year, 2024, was a record year. We never built as much new windmills as we built last year. And you can see we built last year 130 gigawatts of new wind. It's mostly onshore, which means windmills that are just on land, and a little bit of offshore capacity, windmills on the ocean. But as you can see, it's also, generally speaking, becoming more and more and more every year that we build new additional wind capacity at the global level. These graphs show how big the total fleet, the total cumulative number of windmills and solar panels that we have installed as this total number grows year after year. And so for solar, if you add the last year for which there's data here, 2023, at the end of 2023, we had installed more than 1,000 gigawatts of solar. But as you remember, last year we put 600 additional ones. So this is going to grow fast, right? In a few years, it's going to be 2,000, it's going to be 10,000, not many years after that, right? Because also how much we add every year is growing itself. So And the red lines you see on these graphs are indicating on the right y-axis how the price for these things evolved. Solar used to be super expensive, but it's basically gone down very rapidly in price as we scaled up the amount that we make of it, right? So bigger and bigger and bigger factories producing more and more solar panels, that drives down the cost a lot, and so that's what's happening. Another interesting statistic is that last year in the EU, in the European Union, for the first time, we produced more electricity from wind plus solar than from all fossil technologies of making electricity, gas power plants, coal power plants, right? For the first time last year, it was at the EU level more from wind and solar than from fossil technologies. And you can see what the trends are. Few more stats to wrap this part of my class up. Just to give you some ideas of some numbers, because I think it's important to just be aware of at least roughly some of the numbers. Denmark. Well, let's start this way. What are we looking at here? It's a nice plot from Our World in Data. Cool website if you ever want to check it out. Out of all the electricity that is produced in a country, which part of it, which share of it, which percentage of it came from wind energy alone? In Belgium, by 23, that was almost 20%. So here about 1 in 5 electricity units being produced in this country is coming from wind. In the UK, that's already more. They have lots of sea around them, of course. They have lots of offshore windmills in the ocean. And there it's already almost 30%, but Denmark's the champion here. And I'm just showing 3 countries illustratively. If you go to the website, you can see every country in the world, in fact, that you would be interested in. But just to highlight here, in Denmark in 2023, almost 60% of all the electricity produced in that country came from windmills alone. And that's not capacity. That's not, okay, yeah, but is the wind blowing or not? It's really just on an annual basis, how much electricity was produced in a whole year? How much was produced, actually produced and delivered to homes? 60% of it came from wind. And that's still growing in Denmark, so maybe soon 80. Solar, those percentages are lower, but just showing 4 countries here. And it happens to be the case, it's a coincidence, but that Portugal and Belgium are close to each other and that Netherlands and Spain are close to each other. Pay close attention, that's why I'm highlighting it, to the y-axis. So you can see which percentages are we looking at here. In 2023, Portugal, Belgium about 10%, and the other countries almost 20%. So, okay, still not bad, right? Even for Belgium and Netherlands, which are not in the south of Europe and don't get that much sunshine, still, the share of our total electricity we're getting from solar is rapidly growing, as of course these panels are becoming cheaper and becoming more widely available to anybody that wants to install them. Total amount of electricity produced by different renewables. I'm showing this because it's important that you know that historically speaking, by far the biggest source of renewable energy was hydropower. We are already building dams, right? You know those things a lot. You have lots of them in Europe, in Norway, for example. That used to be pretty much the only renewable electricity we had. And then windmills and solar panels became a thing, and they quickly started growing, as you can see. And so now we're in full exponential mode, and they are increasing faster and faster every year. If you look at, okay, counting up all of the renewables, which percentage is that for each country? In Denmark, they're already above 80% in 2023, if you count every source of renewable electricity. Previously, I showed only wind. And the purple line is the whole world. So maybe you're curious what's happening at the global scale there. Globally, in the year 2023, if you look at all the electricity produced in the world, full world, in the year 2023, how much of that in that year came from renewable sources? It was, let's say, 30% in the world. But remember, as I explained at the beginning, this is only electricity. And if you look at the whole world and you say, okay, what is our energy use in the world? by far the biggest part of it is not electricity. It's all of our consumption of oil, gas, and coal. Electricity is only a smaller part of it. So it may sound nice that we are already producing almost 1/3 of our electricity globally from renewable sources, but don't forget we need to still move a lot of stuff towards doing it with electricity, and then we need to move that 30% much higher. Okay, I'm going to skip this, but this now is one, I think, yeah, it's the last part of my, my first two parts of my class, the last slide. I just want to explain here that the energy transition that we're in is not the first energy transition. It may sometimes, sound like that when people talk about it. We need to do the energy transition, but we've done energy transitions in the past. You could say that we've done two of them. In the year 1800, globally speaking, and in all the years that came before 1800, we only had, as humans, one source of energy, and that was biomass, basically wood, right? Stuff you find when you walk around in the forest, etc. And you take it, you cut it, and you burn it. And that was how we did everything that was energy use, how we heated some buildings, right? Try to do some other stuff like cooking food, etc. Biomass was all of it. That was the start of, let's say, our energy use as humanity. And this all changed in, roughly speaking, 100 years, from 1800 to 1900, when we started discovering that there was something under the ground that we could also burn called coal. And in 100 years, we created a sort of a new reality of half of our energy use still coming from biomass, burning stuff from above the ground, and the other half of our energy use came from burning coal. And that was sort of a totally new reality. And then we found some more stuff under the ground that was nice to burn, namely natural gas and oil, which require more advanced techniques to go underground, so that needed to be developed first. And so when we had those techniques, that also boomed. And another 100 years later, we are sort of in the situation of today approximately, which is still in the year 2025 as well. The graph only goes to 15, but still, we're still in a world that is by far predominantly fueled by these three fossil fuels: gas, coal, oil. And the other small stuff that still looks super small at the end of this graph at the right, that stuff is growing now. And I've shown you some graphs showing that it's growing quickly, and it sounded all super positive. And it is a positive thing that these things are now really growing fast year after year. But you see, okay, we're starting, looking at the global picture, we're starting small. And there's a lot of work ahead of us in terms of replacing these three big fossil fuels. And that can take a while, right? These two previous energy transitions that I just described, each took 100 years. And now we're talking about, we're going to do an energy transition where we totally change everything again, away with these fossil fuels and totally new energy sources, and electrifying everything, as I explained. And now the time scale we're talking about is much less than 100 years. We're talking about doing this by the year 2050 in policy and in the Paris Agreement. And more ambitious people at different points in the political spectrum want to do it by 2035. You have some people saying that, right? And it is, of course, a crisis, the climate crisis. And some people conclude from that we should totally do the job by 35, right? That's 10 years from now. Previous energy transitions took 100 years. That's not me saying that it's impossible, don't get me wrong, but let's just not underestimate the challenge. And looking at the history, it could be, you could conclude from that, okay, wow, if we now want to do this radically faster than we did it in the past, this kind of an energy transition, it will be a very tough job, and we're working on it super hard worldwide, many different companies, governments, etc. It's happening. Some things are going very fast, moving in a good direction, but the challenge is also crazy huge. Okay. I've told you about this amazing machine, and I've told you about the role of electricity in the energy transition, electrify everything. I told you about some trends in the world. And the remainder of my class will be about the electricity market, now that I hope to have succeeded in motivating you to care about electricity a bit more. I'll try to explain to you from an economics point of view, how is electricity dealt with, how is it traded, how is it bought and sold, and that's a big explanation. So this would be a good time probably to do a first break. I've been talking for 35 minutes. So let's take a break of 15 minutes. What time is it? Well, let's do 12 minutes. And so it's 38 now. Let's do until 1:50, right? So 10 before 2, I'm going to start again. For the people that can't be here today. And that seems to be, yeah, that's doing its thing. Okay. So as I explained before the break, I'll now tell you about electricity markets. And you can see that this is sort of subdivided into a few parts. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to the last part. That's less important, and we'll see if I already took too long with the other parts, then we'll skip that one. But we'll for sure go up to emission trading. And I want to start off by telling you a bit about the history of electricity markets. Where did we come from? Everything changed in the 1990s when we liberalized our electricity system in Europe. And this is, by the way, a thing that happened also at various points in time, also a bit later than the 90s, in other parts of the world. But in Europe, it started in the 90s. It was part of this whole European Union integration thing. And then in the 90s, we basically decided that we want to do things in a market-based way, with competition and companies buying and selling. But that's not how it used to be. In the whole period before the 90s, so you could, well, as I showed earlier, electricity sort of began in the 1800s already, but you should sort of think about the history here as starting after the Second World War. The Second World War ended, and we had to figure out how are we going to rebuild our European countries, and how are we going to manage our electricity supply. And basically from then, after end of World War II until the 1990s, in almost all European countries, what was decided is to simply have one huge company that is quasi-entirely publicly owned, so owned by the state, doing everything. And by everything, I mean generating all of the electricity. So that means building power plants, mostly coal power plants back in the day, and producing the electricity itself. But also transporting the electricity, first through the highways of the network, the big cables, transmission network, and then through all of the many smaller cables. And transporting also means building that grid, maintaining the grid, right? If something goes wrong in that whole network of cables, fixing it. Also something called system operation. That means if you have all the power plants and you have all the cables, monitoring that whole machine and making sure with lots of people in rooms full of screens and whatever, or at least buttons and dials, monitoring it and making sure from day to day that everything is going smoothly, system operation. And lastly, but not, I mean, it's also a very important thing, billing. It's also one company that all of the small households, millions of households in the country, had their own individual contract with that one company. I'm buying electricity and I'm paying for the production of the electricity and the transport and the system operation, and every household got its own little individual bill based on how much that household consumed. And that's also like a whole activity on its own, doing that properly. And so all of these things, from generation to billing, were completely done in one huge company before the 1990s. And as I already said, this was radically changed in the 90s in what's called the liberalization process, and what is also called in specifically the world of electricity, unbundling. Unbundling means, okay, there's this bunch of stuff that used to be one sort of blob, one big thing, everything stuck together. And let's unbundle this. Let's split it into different activities. And some will be liberalized, and they will, from now on in the 90s, they will be done by companies in a competitive free market, some activities. And also part of this unbundling is that some activities in the world of electricity, they cannot be done by competitive companies. They are still remaining in the hands of the state to some degree, and they are still to some degree a monopoly. So what are these different activities that we have unbundled? We've split up activities that can be seen as natural monopolies and activities that can be seen as competitive activities, market-based ones. So we've defined a few new roles. In Europe in the 90s, we said, okay, there's such a thing that we're going to call generators. These are companies that generate electricity. So if any one of you, after your studies, wants to start a new company, you get some capital from a bank and you build a few windmills or whatever, build a gas power plant if you want. That's what your company does. You invest in that thing, you build it, it produces electricity, and you sell that electricity. Then you are a generator. That's the kind of company you are. And that is categorized, okay, as one of the activities in the electricity sector today in Europe, generators. These are companies, and so many companies do this kind of thing, and they compete with each other. They are free, everybody's free to start a company like that, and these companies compete. Can I build a gas plant or a windmill park better and cheaper or more efficiently than you? And if I can, maybe I'm out competing you because I can sell my stuff for lower prices. Generators. The other competitive activity that's defined in the landscape of today is called retailers. Retailers are basically the middlemen. A retailer buys electricity in very big volumes from the generators, right? The generators produce electricity in enormous amounts, so the retailers buy that, and they have the activity of chopping that up into lots of little chunks, so to speak, and selling it to many, many, many small consumers like individual households or small companies, etc. And that's a competitive activity in itself. You can start a company to do that activity, and you can be good or bad at it, and then you will be able to compete in the market or not. Because one of the parts of that activity, for example, is doing lots of marketing and advertising, right? You see adverts all the time in the city on if you still watch old school TV or maybe on YouTube, right? Ads for companies that sell, oh, you take your electricity contract at our company, it will be green, or it will be a good price, or whatever, right? It will be maybe supporting communities or whatever. Those are retailers, the middlemen that buy the big volumes and sell it in the form of many small volumes. And they also set up the billing systems that I talked about before, right? Whole systems, software systems to generate PDFs to every household for their individual bill. And that's also sort of a thing you can compete on. Like one company may say, I'm gonna go for having a super clear, nice visual bill, and then maybe then people are attracted to getting an electricity contract at my company because I have very clear, nice visual bills. And then you have the two other activities that are still today natural monopolies. So these are not competitive activities, and these are basically grid operators, the owners and the operators of the cables at two levels. The highway levels, the huge cables, that's called transmission system operators, and then you have distribution system operators who are the managers of all the small cables in the streets. So there's a sort of a division there of two levels, but grid operators can't be made a competitive activity where anyone can start a company and compete, because imagine if we would do that, we may have 10 different grids all being built, and in every street there would be 10 cables, right, of 10 competing grid companies. So that would obviously be hugely wasteful, so that doesn't quite work. So what we do there is we create companies. They are technically companies, but they are often still today to a large degree, 20, 30, 50% owned by the government. But we can also become owners of it. You can buy a share in the stock market of these grid companies if you want to. And they are monopolies, so that means that they could, in principle, abuse their power. They could say, hey, for using the grid, I'm going to make you pay, right? And you're going to pay a lot for using the grid because you don't have any alternative, right? You need electricity. And so in order to prevent those companies from abusing their monopoly power, because they are the owner of the one grid, they are heavily regulated, right? There's like a government body called a regulator, constantly overlooking what they are doing and making sure that they basically behave appropriately and don't abuse their monopoly powers. So who are these companies in Belgium? Just so you know, and you may have already heard of them in the past, the transmission system operator in Belgium is Elia. It's just one company. That's their logo, and they own and operate the full transmission network, so all the huge, big cables in Belgium. And then you have in Flanders, right, so only Flanders, you have the company Fluvius, which manages all of the cables in all of the streets, all the lower level, smaller cables. Generators, as I explained, it may be a company that builds a nuclear power plant and produces and sells electricity, or a coal power plant, or a wind park. Those are all generator companies. And if we look at, oh, sorry, yeah, and this, I should have done my previous explanation when this slide was being shown. So retailers, they are the middlemen, as I explained, right? Big volumes to small volumes. And if you look at concrete company names there, some of the generators you've heard about, at least I hope, or I expect. Engie, Luminus, Eneco, if you want green electricity from locally generated with communities, EcoPower. You know these names, but now you may also be wondering, wait, if those are the generators, then who are the retailers? Because retailers are the ones that I have my individual contract with, right? At your, wherever you live, at your cot as a student, or at home at your parents' place, or whatever. You as a household have an individual contract with a company, and that company is a retailer. And these are sort of the same names that you would have a contract with. So how does that work? Well, many of these companies that you see here are both generators and retailers. On paper, strictly speaking, legally speaking, these are two separate companies. You have generator company Engie and retailer company Engie. But in practice and in terms of operation of the business, there's just one company, Engie, and they both build power plants and windmills, and they produce electricity and sell it. And they are also retailers that advertise to households and make individual contracts with many households, right? Generators, retailers. It's important to know, though, that it's possible, if you would like to start a company that is only a retailer. And you have those, in fact, in Belgium. One of them is called Mega. Another one is called Frank Energy, which is hidden behind my face. But so what those are companies that just say, okay, I start a new company. What's my company going to do? I'm going to buy electricity from the generators. I don't have my own power plants that produce electricity. I'm just going to buy it from people that do. And I'm just going to make a business out of the fact that I will resell the electricity to many individual households into little chunks, right? That's just a pure retailer that only has this as an activity, and a company like Mega, that's what they do. So you're now aware of sort of the most important thing about the history that you need to know. We used to come from big, huge monopolies that did everything, right? State-run companies, and now we have this new landscape with combination of natural monopoly companies that operate the grid and competitive markets with generators and retailers. Now let me explain to you why is electricity so special when you talk about markets, because there are of course many markets for many different goods and services. Electricity is a commodity. A commodity is something economists use as a term. Examples of commodities are coffee, chocolate, rice, or grain. A commodity is basically a product of which there can be huge quantities that are completely identical with each other. You can't differentiate. One unit of electricity, no matter how it is produced by no matter which technology, a windmill or a power plant, a unit of electricity is a unit of electricity. It's completely homogeneous. It's identical. and it's being sold at sort of wholesale level in very large quantities. Those are commodities, and other things like rice are, for example, similar in that sense. So electricity is a commodity good, as economists call it, and some of the typical things in the world of commodities are basic supply-demand dynamics. If demand for something goes up, like electricity or coffee or chocolate, then the price goes up. And same if supply goes down, then the price also goes up, and vice versa, as you see on the slide. So basic economic laws are definitely at play in the world of commodities like electricity. And electricity has the characteristic that we don't consume a constant amount of it all the time. It goes up and down. There are spikes every day in how much electricity we consume as a country, also as a household. But if you look at it as a country, or for example Europe as a whole, there is a big spike in electricity consumption every day in the morning when we wake up, turn on lights, turn on the toaster, turn on the water cooker, the kettle, right? And it's not only households, also companies are becoming active, and so there's a huge spike also always in the morning. And then there's an even bigger spike in the evening when we come home, turn on TV, turn on the cooking stove, blah, 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 right? Maybe nowadays plug in the electric car or whatever. And so you have spikes in the morning and the evening, but that in itself is not super unique. You have other products that have spikes. The demand for coffee spikes in the morning, obviously. The demand for beer usually spikes in the evening, right? So that's when those goods are suddenly consumed way more in a particular moment of the day. So that in itself is not super special, but what is very special is the fact that in the case of electricity, demand and supply, how much is being produced and how much is being consumed, must be exactly equal from second to second. You can't just produce some electricity and sort of put it in the grid or something and then consume it at some later time when you need it. That's just not possible due to the laws of physics. So in the case of electricity, we need to somehow make sure that we're 24/7, 365 days a year, producing exactly as much as what's being consumed every second. That's, as you can expect, a very tough job. That's kind of incredible that we even succeed in doing that. And on top of this, the fact that you need to do this perfect balance the whole time, there's this additional difficulty that electricity cannot be stored in a very big way and a very cheap way. If you have huge amounts of rice or cacao, right, or grain, no problem to put a whole warehouse full with, whole building full of that commodity and just leave it there for a few months and then you can sell it or consume it, right? You can't do that with electricity. There are batteries and other things that we can use to store a bit of electricity, but in the large scheme of things, it's almost nothing. And we can still today, we can say we basically can't store electricity. So you have this huge issue. You need to produce exactly as much as being consumed, and you also can't store it, so we can't solve it that way to act as a buffer. So we thought of something, you could say, in the 90s, when we liberalized the whole market, when we went from one company doing everything, that was in a way easy, right? You just had engineers in a big room together, and they were behind the buttons and the dials, and they could just say, okay, all right, making sure that every moment we are producing exactly the right amount. It was all one organization, one team, right? But when we split everything up into some competitive activities and many different companies involved and many different players competing with each other and buying and selling, how do we then make sure that everything stays smooth and that exactly as much is produced every moment as what's being consumed? In order to achieve that, what we did is we built a whole chain of market mechanisms. And it's a complex, big thing that I won't be able to explain fully today. I would need several hours for that. So I'll focus on a small part of it, and I'll get to that. But to summarize, basically, here you see New York during a blackout, when there's just like a total interruption of the supply of electricity, Luckily, it doesn't happen too often, but you can see it's a real picture. It's kind of weird. And you obviously want to avoid that, because there are actually studies about what happens when in a modern society the supply of electricity is interrupted and you have a full blackout like this. It's like after 5 minutes, crime goes up by 100% or something. After 2 hours, it's like up by 1,000%, and you get mass hysteria is beginning. After 1 day, you get like mass chaos. It's basically crazy. If electricity goes out, society goes crazy. Is more or less what you could summarize those studies as. You can look those up if you want to. They're interesting papers to read. But you want to avoid this. And you basically want to never have blackouts like this, or if you have them, to super quickly be able to solve them. And so we do that today in Europe and some other places in the world using markets. And that's why I'm here as an economist to explain this to you. And in particular, we use something that's called forward markets, which I'll get to what that means. It's a particular kind of markets. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn off my mic for a bit and cough, because I have some itch in my throat and I don't want to cough in the mic too loud. Okay, connecting. So my voice is okay again, right? In the back, you can still hear me? Yeah. All right. So what are forward markets? That's what we use to deal with this nowadays. Well, in order to understand what are forward markets, let's start easy. Let's explain what is a spot market. When you go to your local town square, and it's Friday or Saturday or whatever, and it's the weekly fish market, right? And buyers and sellers of fish come together and they trade. That's called a spot market. It's literally, that's what it gets its name from. It's on the spot. The fish is being exchanged immediately and delivered immediately to the consumer in exchange for a payment that also happens immediately. In a forward market, it works differently. And so the electricity market system that I'll get to is full of these kind of forward markets. It's sort of it's not a physical location like a town square. It's more of a software thing, and it's all virtual, right? But buyers and sellers meet on a shared platform. They come to agreements, but the thing they exchange at that moment in the forward market is a contract. And the contract says, at some point in the future, then we will, you will deliver some amount of electricity to me, and I, the buyer, the consumer, will at that moment in the future transfer money to you. And that's what's decided in the forward market, the contract. So it's basically a whole platform of trades that goes on between buyers and sellers that are always coming to these agreements of doing something in the future. And that point in the future, it could be tomorrow, but it could be in a month, or it could be in a year from now, right? So that I'll get to that. Here's sort of the full picture of this whole chain of market mechanisms that we have since the liberalization of the electricity market in Europe. And it's, as I said, too big to explain everything today. But you basically have a bunch of forward markets, which are shown on the left. Yeah, I'll explain them later. And then you have sort of what's called gate closure. So for a particular moment in time, so let's say Thursday next week, electricity could already be traded between buyers and sellers a year ago for Thursday next week. And also even until Wednesday next week, 1 day before. There are still forward markets, and some trade can still go on between free buyers and sellers of what's going to go down on Thursday next week. But at some point, for that particular day, Thursday next week, there will be sort of a referee saying, stop, no more trading, no more making deals about who's going to sell and buy. For that particular day, Thursday next week, we stop. And then on the day itself, it's the grid operator who's actually running the show. It's unfortunate that I'm again in front of my own slide, but the picture here on the top and the bottom right is showing one of those dirigent in Dutch. I don't know what the English word is, right? So an orchestra guy. What's the word? Conductor, exactly. So in real time, the system is not run by market part. Well, the real boss in real time, when really to keep the lights on right now, is the operator and owner of the grids. And in particular, it's at the national level, it's at the transmission level, it's Elia in Belgium. They are really the conductor from moment to moment. And when they see, okay, we had here in our books, you're going to buy that much, you're going to sell that much, you made the deal in the forward market, okay. Okay, so from 3 to 4 tomorrow, so it's 3 to 4 now, and you guys said that you were going to put that much into the grid and you're going to consume that much. Okay, that's what was sort of registered beforehand. But then if Elia, if the operator of the grid sees that what's actually happening is a bit more is being produced than what was written down, let's say, or a bit more is consumed or less is produced, anyway, something else is happening than what was the deals that were made in the forward market, which can, for example, happen if if I'm a wind park generator, I sell my electricity. Tomorrow from 3 to 4, there will be so much wind. I will sell this to a consumer that buys this electricity, and then from 3 to 4 on the actual day itself, it's slightly less windy than I thought from the forecast, right? If that, for example, happens, then you made some deal. The wind guy is going to produce that much, but in practice it's less, and then the system operator Elia has to deal with it in practice. They just see, less is being produced than what was written down. And so they are the boss in real time, and then they have their own ways, which I can't explain, to basically turn some dials and to make sure that everything stays exactly smooth and consumption and production stays exactly the same second to second. So, but how all of that particular stuff works, I'm not gonna get into. So how does trading of electricity work, right? In my previous example of going to the fish market, you can visualize perfectly what that's like, right? To buy fish on a real life market in a town square. But the trading of electricity looks like this. You basically have lots of companies that want to buy electricity and lots of companies that want to sell electricity, and they are all represented by guys like these. They are called, or girls, they are called traders, usually guys though, and they sit behind huge rows of computer screens all day. They look at all kinds of data coming in on these screens, and they try to make good decisions. And if I'm, for example, a trader for a company that needs to buy a lot of electricity, my job is to make sure that enough electricity is being bought, so the company has enough electricity, but that I do this at the cheapest possible price, right? I'm a good trader if I can sort of make sure that my company has all the electricity it needs at the lowest possible price. And a trader for somebody that sells electricity wants to sell at the highest possible price. So you have this world of traders in front of computer screens. The two parts of this whole chain that I'm going to explain further are the futures markets and the day-ahead markets, which you could say are the two most important parts of this whole chain. The two biggest things you need to understand about it. To a certain degree, all the rest are technical details that only huge nerds like myself like to delve into. The main, wait, I can't go back, okay. So the main difference between futures markets, which is one type of electricity market, you could say, and the day-ahead market, another electricity market, is when is the electricity being traded on that market going to be delivered? In futures markets, we talk about making trades between buyers and sellers for electricity that is going to actually be delivered in a particular month in the future or in a particular quarter. Each year has 4 quarters, right? Fiscal quarters. In which quarter is it going to be delivered? Or even in a particular future year, which could be 1, 2, 3 years into the future. And so that's the kind of contracts being bought and sold on futures markets. And I'll explain it in more detail later. The day ahead market, it's all about delivery of electricity, as the name implies, the next day. So literally every day there is a moment when the day ahead market happens, so to speak, for buying and selling electricity for delivery the next day, for each of the 24 hours of the next day. Let's start with the futures market. I want to explain the principle of the futures market to you by comparing it or using as an analogy the process of somebody at the head of a family, at the head of a household, some mom or dad, and I want you to imagine that this mom or dad has to think about all of the bread that will be consumed in the family for the whole next year, and that you would like to somehow already sign some contracts and make sure that you have enough bread every day in your household, right? Now, in the year 2026, next year, this person may expect that how much bread we will consume from day to day in our house. It will probably go up and down a bit throughout the year, right? I'm not sure. Maybe there are some periods where we have higher consumption of bread, but you don't actually know this beforehand, right? You don't have a perfect glass ball into the future allowing you to know exactly what the bread consumption will be every day next year. So that's why it's actually like I'm showing it here now as a dotted line. It's sort of this uncertain thing that you don't really know exactly. But you may have a vague sense. You may know that in any case I'm going to eat one bread a day or something in my household. And maybe there's going to be a period in the middle of the year when for a few months we'll eat for sure at least 2 breads a day. Maybe because some friends of your kids are staying over for an extended period or whatever. And so what you could do is you could go to your local bakery, and you could tell that person, hey, for next year, I already want to sign a contract with you that for the whole year 2026, I will buy 1 bread for you every day. That's sort of the yellow part. At this price that you make a deal for, and the baker is also very happy because he already has certainty that he will sell a bread every day for a certain price, and he has already some nice fixed income that he has for next year. Okay, that's already sure, so that's nice for my business. And the family's happy because they already have sort of this base layer of bread supply every day. And maybe also they make a separate contract for this period in the middle of the year when the buyer is sure that they will need 2 breads a day, and that's also a contract that's being signed for that period for a few months, 1 more bread every day. And then throughout the actual year, as it happens from January 1st to December, you will find out every day how much bread you actually needed, right? And you'll notice on some days, and that's what the arrows represent, oh, I actually need way more today. I couldn't have possibly predicted that a year ago. And then you sort of run to the bakery every day to get whatever sort of remaining bread that you still need. And so these first 2 big blocks that I explained are basically what you would do on a futures market. You buy the very big amounts that you're already approximately sure of. And so most of your bread is bought and sold on the futures market, most of the volume. But there is still this need to have another market to deal with the day-to-day fluctuations that you can't predict perfectly from a long time beforehand. And that's what the day-ahead market is for, right? Let's say the daily bread market. Right, so that's sort of the analogy to make it as easy as possible. And I just want to wrap up this analogy by also making you aware that different strategies are possible. You could have said, if you're that mom or dad, that for the whole year, I'm already going to contract with the bakery 2 breads a day. And then for this part in orange, I will do another bread. And then, I mean, you're free to do that, but and then you just have a different situation. Then you just have a situation where instead of having some shortages that are left and that you still have to fill in, you still have some smaller shortages sometimes, but especially you have some moments of excess, and then you need to go sell the bread you already bought on the day-ahead market, right? You have to go run to the local town square or whatever and say, okay, I have some bread. I bought this I contracted this a year ago. Hopefully not year-old bread, but I contracted this a year ago, and now I actually don't, and I end up not needing it, so I want to sell it. That's also possible, and you can also do that on the day-ahead market. Another cough, but I won't turn off the mic, so sorry. Let's talk a bit more about futures, but I'll be quick. There's lots of details, of course, to know about this stuff, and I'll try not to bore you with too many of them. But just to quickly make you aware of some stuff, futures markets for electricity, they trade in standardized products, completely standardized products. So for example, there could be a product that says, okay, delivering a constant amount of electricity for the whole calendar year 2026. This is a product that has a name. It's called Cal26. Cal26 is just an abbreviation. That's the name of that kind of a product. Delivering a constant amount of electricity 24/7, all 365 days of the next year. That's defined in a way, then it's a very standardized product, and then you can do trade, of course. You can say, everybody that wants to sell this, that can actually do this, produce a constant amount of electricity the whole year, right, can sell this product, Cal26, and anyone that wants to buy this, maybe I'm a big factory and I know for sure that I will already have some amount of electricity consumption the whole year next year, I can buy this product, and then I already know, okay, next year, every day of the year, 24/7, I will already have some base amount of electricity delivered to me for a certain price. So in futures markets for electricity, standardized products are used, and it's a public market. That's also important. It all happens in the open. So what trades happen and in what quantities and for which prices is all visible to each of us. You can browse to the websites of those platforms where it all happens, and you can look at that stuff. The standardized products, they can be, as I just gave an example, for a full year, but you can also have standardized products for a particular month in the future, whatever, for November this year, okay, delivering electricity 24/7 in the full month November, right? Anybody that can sell that, anybody that wants to buy that, and they can then trade this standardized product. There's some more detail here, like sometimes these products are split up into what is called base and peak. So Cal26, I just said 24/7 the whole year, a constant amount of electricity, that would be base. If it's called peak, so the product with the name Cal26 peak, that would actually mean, oh, okay, what the contract is for the whole calendar year 2026, electricity will be produced and delivered in a constant way every day of the year from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening. And no electricity will be delivered in the other hours of the day. That's called peak. It's another kind of standardized product that's traded, bought and sold in the futures markets, which is what this slide was supposed to explain. Forgot I made that one. And so in electricity market terms, in my bakery analogy, the yellow part could be a product, a futures product with the name Cal26 base. And maybe the orange part could be a product called 2026 quarter 2 base. Okay. Here's a screenshot of those platforms. So you can see EEX is one of those market platforms where buyers and sellers meet to trade in these standardized products. And you can see, okay, the product, this is a screenshot for a while ago. So then the product Cal25 was still being traded, and it was being traded at a particular price. And a good thing to know about this is that the price of these standardized products can constantly be changing, right? So you can imagine, we had this, you all remember, I assume, we had this huge energy crisis when the war in Ukraine began and Putin turned down the gas pipes to Europe, and we had a huge energy crisis in Europe. The product to deliver electricity throughout the whole year 2022, when the war was really started and in its full crisis, that product for 2022 was already being bought and sold in the year 2020 during the pandemic, for example, when nobody knew that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. So you can imagine at that time, it may have had a normal price, some price that's sort of average for that kind of a service, that kind of a product. But then as soon as in 2021, throughout the end of 2021, after September, October, November, we got the satellite images of the tanks of Russia at the border, and it became more and more likely that Putin was actually going to do this and actually going to invade. Then the price of the product, Cal 22, to deliver electricity non-stop in the whole year 2022, which was then at that time the next year, the upcoming year, the price of that suddenly skyrocketed, right? Because the sellers of that product knew very well, whoa, if this stuff goes down, electricity prices are going to go really up high, and so I am not selling my my ability to produce electricity the whole year for just some average normal amount, right? I'm going to make you pay more for it. So the prices of these individual products, here you see some examples, they fluctuate themselves as well, right? So that's what those markets are for, of course, for finding out the price. Right. I'm going to skip over some details here, which are not too important. And I'm going to take a look at how long. Okay. I guess it would be a good time to do another break here now. So let's do another 14-minute break this time until 45. So 2:45, we'll restart to do the last part of the class. All right. So where we left off was by explaining the first big part of the whole chain that was set up in the liberalization process of our energy system, chain of market systems to deal with this complex thing of delivering exactly the right amount of electricity at all times, namely the futures market. And I said that I would explain one other big important part of this whole chain, which is the day-ahead market. The day-ahead market for electricity. And so just to reiterate, that's what you use for the arrows in this figure I've showed, right? To deal with this sort of the residual smaller volumes of electricity that have to be traded from day to day between buyers and sellers in order to deal with the fluctuations, mostly that can't be perfectly predicted from a long time beforehand. The day-ahead market. So very concretely, the day-ahead market is an auction. An auction is, right, if I were to stand here with a nice painting in the middle of the podium and we were to shout out how much everybody bids to buy the painting, that's an auction, right? And so it works in the same way. It's a daily auction that happens at noon, middle of the day, every day. And the auction is about the delivery of electricity in each of the 24 hours of the next day. So buyers and sellers, when this auction happens, again, it's all virtual. It's all these, in practice, it's all traders, right? All of these people behind computer screens that represent buyers and sellers. And they can submit until a certain deadline, which is, I believe, something like 1 hour before the auction actually happens or something. So imagine 11 a.m. or something like that. But until that deadline, they can submit bids. Both buyers and sellers can. And the bid is something like, if I'm a seller, if I'm a producer of electricity, I could say, I have some electricity to sell tomorrow from 10 a.m. in the morning until 3 p.m. in the afternoon. In each of those hours, this is how much electricity I'm willing to produce and sell. And this is the price that I'm willing to sell it at. That's what's called a bid of someone selling electricity. And in the opposite direction, a buyer can also make a bid that's something along the lines of, I want to buy X amount of electricity from that hour to that hour. It could also just be for each of the 24 hours of the next day, but not necessarily. You could make bids for separate hours and say, okay, I'm willing to pay this much for this quantity of electricity that I want to buy. So key to know about this daily auction that occurs is that after many years of, let's say, making upgrades and updates, we have arrived at a fully European integrated thing. So there's something, so the day-ahead market concretely in Europe is the European day-ahead market. As I showed all the way in the beginning, Europe is one huge interconnected electricity system with cables all across the place, and everything's interconnected. And so there's one auction every day at noon, and all the buyers and all the sellers across the whole continent make their bids. And everything's thrown onto one huge pile. All the bids from people, well, traders that want to buy electricity at certain quantities and certain hours of the day at certain prices, and all the bids of sellers that want to, you know, some gas power plant, some windmill park, etc., etc. Everything's thrown onto one pile. And by the way, it's even possible, that is a detail, but it's possible to make something called block bids. That's really next level stuff if you're a trader, but that would be something like, I'm willing to sell electricity from 4 to 8 tomorrow at this quantity, this price, but it's sort of take it or leave it as a group deal, or how should I call it, right? It's as a package deal. Either my bid is going to be accepted and the whole 4 hours will be delivered, or, you know, if it would only be that somebody wants to buy one of those 4 hours or whatever, then it's not accepted. That's a block bid. Take it or leave it, a whole block. But that's a detail, as I said. I was just saying that all the bids from buyers and sellers are being thrown onto one huge pile for all of Europe. This happens concretely on these platforms that I talked about, which are also called exchanges, software platforms where all the buyers and sellers can make their bids. And then there is, when the deadline happens and no more bids can be submitted, then the software goes to work, and there's this one amazingly complex algorithm, computer software algorithm, that basically figures out, okay, given all of these bids from all over the continent, from buyers and sellers willing to buy and sell certain quantities at certain prices, what do we now actually need to do? Who do we connect with who? Which buyer do we connect with which seller? How much is going to be bought and sold in total? How much is actually going to be produced tomorrow in each hour of the day? And what will be the outcome of this market, right? How will the market be cleared, is what we would say as economists. This algorithm has a name. It's called euphemia. It's some abbreviation, I think, for a very long sentence. But it's interesting to know this was actually developed in Belgium. That's just a historical coincidence. So, but in a sense, it's Belgian pride, right? We have the algorithm made in Belgium, and that thing deals with this very complex task of figuring out what the outcome should be of this bidding process. And I won't go into detail, obviously, on how euphemia works exactly. Even I also don't know that, but the basics of it is that it's basically trying to maximize economic welfare. What does that mean? It's going to try to come up with a market outcome, you could say in simple terms, in which, you know, as many buyers and sellers are as satisfied as they could possibly be, and sort of the total satisfaction among those two groups is sort of as large as possible. But there is in any case going to be some point where demand and supply curves meet, and that's sort of where the market is going to clear. But euphemia does more than only matching supply and demand or finding the intersection of the two. What euphemia also does is it takes into account all of the technical detail of this complicated European grid of thousands of cables. As I said earlier, Portugal only has a connection with Spain, right, etc., etc. Some countries are very well interconnected, others are not. Those connections, those literal cables that go across country borders, they have certain capacities. You can't transfer infinitely as much electricity through them as you want. And And so the algorithm has to take that into account, obviously. If there's some buyer in Portugal and he wants to buy very cheap wind power from some seller of wind power in Finland, that may be nice in practice. But if there is some kind of a bottleneck technically in this whole network, the algorithm needs to know this and needs to take it into account in order to come up with a solution, an outcome of the market that takes all of these technical constraints into account. And so that's what Euphemia does. It's incredibly complex. No more detail is important on that, but good to know, at least the basics. Just to show you very quickly what has come out of this day-ahead market for electricity in Europe. Well, here are some average prices that of sort of day-to-day what came out of that market in the blue line, the blue-greenish line, which is that from 2017 and also before that until 2021, so including the pandemic, we had electricity prices in Europe that were hovering always around an average of about 40 euros per megawatt hour. What a megawatt hour is pretty abstract, right? But one reference point is that a household in Flanders consumes about 3 megawatt hours of electricity on a yearly basis. So in a whole year, a single household consumes about 3 megawatt hours. On the wholesale market, where the traders meet, 1 megawatt hour cost about 40 euros before. And then, of course, Putin invaded Ukraine. We had this huge energy crisis. Prices also in the day-ahead market for electricity were super high. And you can see that they went up in a very similar way as the orange line, which is the price for gas. Natural gas. And so there seems to clearly be some kind of a link, which I'll get back to, between the gas price and the electricity price. There's some kind of an influence on each other, that's clear. And after sort of the worst of the energy crisis was behind us and Europe somehow managed to get more natural gas from other places than Russia, and also just conserved more energy and just used less gas than it previously did, prices came down. Recently, they've been going up again a bit. Right now, early 2025, we're at the price level in the day-ahead market of electricity, hovering around, on average, 100 euros per megawatt hour. So just good to know that this energy crisis isn't fully digested. It's not sort of history and it's over and we're back to normal. We're still in a new reality in Europe where electricity is more than 2 times as expensive as it used to be before the war in Ukraine started. So, and this is, I mean, it's tough for households, especially let's say poorer households, but it's of course also tough for all kinds of different companies that use very large quantities of energy as part of their process. It's more than twice as expensive as it used to be. Some basic economics before I get to the details of the day-ahead market, supply and demand. Maybe quick raise of hands, which one of you have already had a basic economics 101 course, like Introduction to Economics or something? Okay, that's good news. So I don't really need to explain this. So you've seen more than enough of these silly little graphs that economists like to draw, and you've probably seen many variations on them and need to answer exam questions about them. So I won't explain it in detail. But okay, obviously you have a demand for a good that goes down as the prices. That goes up as the price increases or goes down as the price decreases, and the opposite for supply. And there are some points where they intersect, which is where okay. So supply and demand obviously have to meet. That's also the case. It's in every market that economists talk about. Market for shoes, market for fish, whatever. Also in the market for electricity. And as electricity is a commodity, like rice and cacao powder and grain, I want to explain the principle of what's called marginal pricing, which is very key to understanding the day-ahead market for electricity. By again going back to a simpler analogy of another market. It was bread earlier, right? Now I'm going to talk a bit about grain, but in a shorter way. So I want to tell you basically a story of 2 farms. They both produce grain. Let's imagine you have a modern farm which has very large fields and very modern equipment and not so much manual labor going on. It's mostly the machines doing stuff. And you have a traditional farm with smaller fields and lots of manual labor and maybe older ways of doing things. And they both produce grain. And the grain they produce is indistinguishable from each other. If you would have like a piece of grain from the modern and the traditional farm, and you looked at them, it would be completely identical, right? That's a commodity, right? It's homogeneous, it's the same good, undistinguishable. But the price at which the modern farm can sell grain, produce and sell grain, is in this toy example, is €2 per ton. And the price for the traditional farm at its production cost, I should say, is €10 per ton. Now imagine that the demand for grain in this hypothetical world looks like this, and the demand curve is here. What this tells you is that in order to satisfy demand, you need all the grain of the modern farm and also some of the grain that the traditional farm can produce. And then you can ask, okay, given this situation, you have this demand for grain and these producers with these production costs, what's going to be the outcome? How is the market going to clear? What is going to be the price for grain? Well, the price for grain will be €10 per ton, equal to the production cost of the traditional farm. That's marginal pricing. It's namely the production cost of what is called the marginal firm, or here I should say the marginal farm, which is the last one in a row. If you order them from cheapest to most expensive production cost, the last one in the row that is still needed, at least partially, to meet the full demand, that's called the marginal firm. And the price at which the market clears, and so the price of grain that everybody pays and that every producer of grain receives, one price, it will be the production cost of the marginal firm, here the production cost of the traditional farm. Now why is that the case? That's marginal pricing, but people say all kinds of things about this, of course. They say that's not fair. The modern farm should probably sell at a lower price, right? Why should they make this sort of profit of 8 and receive a price of 10? Now, one thing you could say is that the modern farm sees that people are buying identical grain from the traditional farm for a price of 10. And you can say already, why would the modern farm look at that and say, oh, I'll sell this exact same grain for 2 because it only costs me 2 to produce it. You can understand from the perspective of the modern farm why they wouldn't like to do that. But for the sake of argument, let's imagine that they would be willing to do that, and imagine what happens. Imagine what happens when the modern farm announces, I have a production cost of 2 and I'm willing to sell my identical grain as the other guy sells for a price of €2 per ton. What will happen if this is sort of imagine a town square, right? Everybody's standing together on one big town square, the buyers and these 2 sellers. Everybody goes to the modern farm. And they all start yelling to him and they say, I want your grain for $2. And they all yell this, and together they have a higher demand, and together they have a higher demand than what the modern farm can fulfill. So economists as scientists study what happens in this situation. They've been doing that for many decades, and it's an empirical science. It's a science about human behavior, observing, just by standing on the side and observing what happens. In this kind of a situation, what will happen, that's what we find empirically, without any involvement of the economists themselves, is that somebody in this story, simplified story, will start yelling, some of the buyers will start yelling, okay, I will pay 3 for the grain, right? The others want your grain for 2, but I'll pay 3. And then somebody else, obviously, I'll pay 4 and I'll pay 5. And that sort of process, that competition between the buyers, it just continues. And you can imagine, okay, until when does this continue? When, or rather, when does this stop? It stops until somebody yells, I'll pay 10. Because at that particular moment in time, all the buyers, they just become indifferent with regard to buying it either from the modern farm or from the traditional farm. Then they don't care anymore. And what happens is, at the end of this sort of process of people yelling at each other on a town square, when they all go home in the evening, all the grain was sold at the price of 10. This is an empirical observation. It's not something, this marginal pricing is something that's observed by economists. and it's not something that economists have invented, like, oh, it would be theoretically ideal to do marginal pricing, and now we economists say that everybody should do it like that. Some people, during the energy crisis, it came up a lot on the media. I was also asked myself to explain it sometimes to a radio interviewer or whatever. Like, why does the electricity market work like this? Why does it use marginal pricing? Who the hell invented that? It's so silly. Why should somebody selling electricity cheaper receive the higher price? And it's basically because marginal pricing is just a sort of a natural outcome of free markets trading, buyers and sellers trading with each other. A commodity like electricity or grain or rice. It's exactly the same for other commodity products. Take oil, for example. This is a super simplified way of showing it, which isn't correct, but just for the sake of making it simple. Imagine, okay, Saudi Arabia can produce a certain quantity, which is indicated by how wide this box of Saudi Arabia is. Saudi Arabia can produce a certain amount of oil at a certain price, which is indicated with the height of the box. And then Russia can also sell a certain amount of, what have I been saying, oil for a certain price. And so on and so on. And maybe if you then also maybe make a jump from countries to special kinds of oil production that are more rare and expensive, like shale oil and deep sea oil, those are smaller quantities that can be produced at even higher production costs. If you then need, as a world, a certain amount of oil that you demand, that you want to consume, it may be that you need all the oil from Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US, and some shale oil, and you don't need any of the deep sea oil. So they are not selected, they don't produce and they don't sell any oil, but all the others, including some shale oil, are selected in the market, and the price of oil that everybody pays, or if you're a seller, receives, including Saudi Arabia with their much lower production cost, is the clearing price, which is equal to the production cost of the marginal firm, marginal pricing. So now that you know this concept, let's talk about how this is applied concretely in the electricity market. If you look at a particular day, this is again a hypothetical simplified example, how the demand for electricity in a country like Belgium evolves throughout the hours of a day. It has, as I said earlier, some peaks, right? It's not a very good figure because it doesn't show very clearly the morning and evening peak, but ignore that. Some peaks and troughs. Demand for electricity fluctuates throughout the day. Now, that means that in every individual hour of the day, we need a different amount of electricity that needs to be produced, and that exact amount needs to be produced in order to have this perfect balance that I talked about, right? In order to keep the lights on, due to physics. So you have these different quantities. Now, if you look at, okay, which technologies could produce those technologies, maybe blue here, if I subdivide it into technologies that produce the electricity, blue may be wind, maybe, let's take blue as nuclear energy, and green could be wind. Maybe there's not so much wind in 1 hour, but twice as much wind in another hour, so they can produce more. And in red and orange, different kinds of gas power plants, for example. So what this immediately already tells you is that some hours of the day, the full demand for electricity of a country can be met by a more limited amount of technologies, maybe in this point in the nighttime when there's lower demand, some like 3 a.m. in the morning or whatever. Maybe then all the electricity in the country is just being met by only some nuclear and wind energy. But maybe during some evening peak in the evening, 6 to 7 in the evening, then maybe you need this whole different bunch of technologies working all together and producing all together to meet the demand in that hour of the day. Now, if you take such a mix of different quantities being produced by different technologies and you put it on its side, then you get the supply curve for electricity. So I have a nice animation here, which I'm very proud of in PowerPoint. And so, okay, that's what that then looks at. If you think back to the traditional farm and the modern farm, and think back to the oil production across the world, Saudi Arabia, US. This is what that looks like for electricity in the day-ahead market. So as I said before, all of the willing producers of electricity, they all make these bids, right? They make these bids and they make it known on the platform, on the day-ahead market platform. They make it known which quantity, how much they are willing to produce, sell electricity, and at which price. Now, I'm simplifying again here, but imagine there's like a technology called Green 1, nuclear, Green 2, Coal 1, Coal 2, Gas 1, Gas 2, and they can all bid in the market to produce a certain quantity, the width of the box, for a certain price, the height of the box. Remember, the day-ahead market is an auction, right? It's the guy standing in the middle with the painting and taking all the bids of who wants to buy, who wants to sell, at what prices. And so a figure like this would represent what the potential supply of electricity looks like. So the supply curve of, okay, just looking at how much electricity could be supplied by the different bidders at different prices and quantities in a particular hour, 6 to 7. The supply curve for electricity for 6 to 7 in a particular day-ahead auction. Let's simplify for demand and represent that as a just little line here. And so again, you get this intersection between supply and demand, and you can see that on this particular hour of the day, given a certain amount of electricity that is demanded at that hour, you would need all of the technologies from Green 1 up to and including Gas 1, which you would only need partially. That gas plant, let's say if it's one plant, would only need to be turned on at like 30% and not at 100% in order to fully meet the demand. So you get an intersection, a point where the two lines cross. And that's where the day-ahead market will clear. That's what the outcome will be of the Euphemia algorithm. It's hugely simplified here, but there will be one price, right, that everybody pays and every buyer pays and every seller receives. Okay, and this is what that actually looks like in practice. If you really browse on your laptop to the sorry. If you browse to the website of this platform, it's all public, so you can look at what the outcomes are of these markets. And this is from some days ago, 31st of January this year. You could see that for one particular hour, 6 to 7, this was the demand curve. As you can see, it doesn't quite look as simple as I visualized it in my own figure. So, sorry, the supply curve in gray and the demand curve in orange, they intersect at a certain point, and that is the amount of electricity that will be actually produced and consumed for that hour of the day. That's the outcome of the day-ahead market for that hour. Now, again, the same point about marginal pricing does come up. You can say, but technology Green 1, maybe that's a windmill, and well, once you've built your windmill, you don't have that much cost to produce electricity, right? The wind blows for free, so you can bid into the day-ahead market that you are willing to produce some amount at each hour of the next day for some very low price. Because as soon as you, let's say, receive a few euros per megawatt hour, you're happy and you're making money, let's say, compared to if the wind was blowing but you would not be selling that, you're very quickly happy to be selling. If you can't sell, you want to sell, and so you bid to you express your willingness to do that at a very low price. So that's Green 1, but Green 1 receives the market clearing price, receives much more than its marginal production cost. And the last selected one, the marginal firm, Gas 1, they basically receive exactly the amount, exactly the price that they also have bidded into the market. So they just sort of receive exactly as much as they were asking for, so they're not really making a lot of extra profit, right? They're just covering their costs. The sort of the distance between the price and the cost of each technology, the part, I'm not sure what arceren is in English, but anyway, that part with the small lines, that's called inframarginal rent. That's just an economist's term. And you can again say, how is that fair? Well, the thing you really have to keep in mind is that Green 1, if, as I just said, hypothetically, it's a wind park, they can bid into the market that they are willing to produce at a very low price because they definitely want to be selected and allowed to produce electricity because the wind will be blowing, they will be producing it anyway, so they want to be selected, they bid a low price. That's their willingness, their expression of their willingness. But they actually need to receive much more than that if they want to be profitable in the long term and actually cover their costs. Why? Building the windmill required some millions of euros of investment upfront on day one to build a windmill. So you're going into debt with some bank, like building a house, right? And you need to pay back that huge sum of capital. And so you need that infra-marginal rent in order to pay back your big capital investment costs. So it's like, and if you work it out, and economists have done this, in some like hypothetical, like a simulated world where you say, okay, some number of years this happens, and then, okay, how much money is everybody receiving, and are they covering their costs? What comes out of that kind of a simulation, where you have perfect information of everything, which you don't in the real world, then you basically see that this basically just covers everything just quite like perfectly. So like the windmill is going to receive out of this mechanism exactly enough to earn back the wind mill that he built. And as soon as there's sort of an excess, like it's like excessively profitable to build a windmill, and the inframarginal rent is paying for much, much more than only covering the cost of building it, that just sort of triggers new people wanting to build windmills, and then you get more windmills, and the prices eventually go down, and sort of it finds sort of the point at which it finds an eventual equilibrium and like stable endpoint is at the point where sort of all the technologies that are needed are just recovering exactly their costs. So at least in theory, that's how this works. In practice, you can have some other outcomes due to a variety of complex reasons. If the demand in another hour of the day, as I said earlier, 2 to 3 in the morning, we're using less electricity as a country, and the demand is lower, the curve has shifted to the left, then maybe the intersection is here, and then maybe in that hour, it's sufficient to only have the technologies up to call 1 to be activated, and then the price for that hour could be much lower, right? And then the clearing price for that hour is much lower because you just need less electricity, and the intersection of supply and demand is at a lower price level. Conversely, if there's like this other moment in the day when the block for green 1 is super wide because it's like a super windy day and there's so much wind that a very large volume of electricity can be produced by windmills, then those windmill owners, they can bid into the market, say, wow, tomorrow 7 to 8, I can produce this huge amount of electricity, and at the same low price as always that I'm willing to produce. And so then this block becomes much wider, and the supply curve gets sort of stretched out. And this is the same demand curve as the first one, with the high price that was at the level of gas 1. But just because there's way more wind and a way wider green block, the points at where the demand and supply curves cross is suddenly different. Now you need everything only up to call 1. And so for the same high demand as in the initial graph, suddenly the price is way lower because there's a way bigger green 1 block, let's say. So that just gives you some intuitive idea of how the day-ahead market for electricity works. Now, as I showed in the, oh, sorry, yes, go ahead. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so to repeat the question, because it won't be on the recording. So if we get way more renewables, what does that do to your supply graph, your supply, your supply curve, and sort of what happens to inframarginal rents? Will they still be sufficient? This is actually an academic area of research. So there is sort of a debate whether or not this way that we've set it up continues to function properly when in the long term we have way bigger, let's say, volumes of wind and solar power injecting into the system. Because indeed, you will have on a daily basis in the day-ahead market, you will have these huge volumes of renewables being bid into the market at super low prices. And indeed, that could result in prices becoming super low, and then even the renewables don't really receive enough for them to receive to be able to recover their investment costs. This is already happening to a certain degree, by the way. So I showed you in the beginning some graphs that it's going fast, and we're installing lots of wind and solar, more and more every year. And we're starting to really see the results of this, especially solar, because solar energy is so concentrated in the middle of the day. So you can imagine in weekend days in the middle of summer, on Sundays in the middle of summer of August, for example, the overall electricity demand in the country is somewhat on the low side, relatively speaking to middle of winter. And especially also because it's weekend. That's why I'm taking that as an example. Also, then the electricity demand is somewhat lower than in the middle of the week. So on a summer weekend day, it's now starting to happen more and more, and it's happened quite a lot already for many hours, many instances of this in the last summer in 2024 in Belgium and other countries, that there's not so much demand for electricity around the sunny hours in the middle of the day, on a weekend day. But then there's like this huge amount of production from all the solar panels in your country, and you actually, the result that comes out of the day-ahead market is that prices are zero or even negative. So it's perfectly possible that out of this market comes a negative price, which basically means paying people to consume electricity. And so this is actually happening, and it's happening more and more during some of these instances with low demand, during some hours when you have very high production. And we can expect this to increase over time. One of the things that sort of fixes it, or is one way to address it in the long term, but I won't go into it in detail, is making it such that the demand for electricity, the consumption of electricity, actually is way more responsive to the price. Because who amongst us today actually thinks about, like, oh, is it from 3 to 4? Is electricity expensive or cheap? Should I like turn on my microwave or something because it's cheap electricity now? Nobody, right? Like we basically don't think about this at all as final consumers. Some of the huge, big industrial companies that consume huge volumes, they have some people on that sort of try to take that into account a bit. But also there, it's quite small, the amount to which they react to these fluctuations in the price. Let's change that. So that's one of the things we need to do. As we transition cars to electric cars, and as we transition the heating of homes to heating with heat pumps instead of gas boilers, one of the smart things we need to do is to try to concentrate that electricity demand into the hours with lots of renewable electricity. So for example, charging your car, trying to the degree possible, concentrate the car charging into the hours when there's lots of wind and sun. And then you have a higher demand for electricity during the hours when there's also lots of cheap supply, and then the market outcome is no longer zero or negative price. So it's a way of creating a symbiosis where both on the consumption and the production side, things match better, and you get a market outcome that sort of works for everyone. That's an aspect of the energy transition that I won't go into, but hope to have satisfied you with that answer. So wrapping up about marginal pricing, just to summarize again, what are some of the misconceptions about this? One misconception that came up a lot, especially during the energy crisis 2 years ago, was that it's completely unique, that this is something only used in electricity markets, which is totally untrue. Commodities are priced on the margin, as they say. All commodities, gold, silver, whatever. Lots of like big homogeneous products that are sold in large quantities. Another thing that's a misconception is that marginal pricing is prescriptive, as if economists or whoever, politicians, whatever, said like, this is the way we're going to do it, and you all need to now follow this rule or whatever. It's in fact not true. It's descriptive. It's what happens in the free market if you just let the buyers and sellers do their thing. Then they do marginal pricing. It's how they behave, and this is just an observation. And the third misconception is that that there's this exact link between electricity prices and gas prices. I showed before that the electricity price is sometimes equal to the production cost of the gas plant. That was the last one that was needed to meet the demand. And this creates a sort of a link between gas prices and electricity prices. If you need gas plants every so often to meet your whole demand for electricity, that also means that if the gas that they burn to make electricity becomes more expensive, that their production cost goes up, and therefore the price of electricity goes up. So there's a link between gas prices and electricity prices in that way, but marginal pricing does not mean that there's like some super strict formula link, electricity price equals gas price times X or something. It doesn't quite work like that. So there's only sometimes, let's say, a correlation or a link between electricity and gas prices. I'm almost done. So let's just wrap up by, and I'll skip CFDs as I said in the beginning, and just let's wrap up with a very short, brief last point. I've explained the day-ahead market, and so the last thing that I just want to note on this is that there's this, well, I was almost going to say new system, but it's not really new. It's in fact came into existence 15 years ago in 2010, called the European Emission Trading System. And I'm pretty sure you've all heard about it, right? Within the European Union, we thought of basically a market-based way to put a price on carbon, to make people that emit greenhouse gases, to make them pay for it. And the way we set it up is that we say, okay, if you're going to emit, and this is only applicable at the moment for very large emitters, big factories, right? Such things, and also, so not only big factories like a steel factory, but also big factories like a gas power plant, which produce electricity, which is also a large industrial, large size economic activity. And so they all fall under this system. Individual households like us, and the emissions we cause, like the emissions that come out of our house because we heat our house with gas, or the emissions that come out of our car because we drive our oil-fueled car or whatever, those do not currently fall under the emission trading system. Only the big installations do, that emit high volumes, or these huge volumes individually. And so in that system, we're saying, if you're going to emit 1 ton of carbon, you need permission. You need to submit, for every ton of carbon emissions that comes out of your chimney, you need to submit a little piece of paper. It's virtual in practice, of course, but imagine a piece of paper that says, allowance to emit 1 ton. And this allowance paper for 1 ton of CO2 is something it's being measured, how much you emit from your big factory chimney. And for every ton, you need to give to like a government body 1 allowance for emitting 1 ton of CO2. And then the whole point of the system is that these allowances to emit carbon are going to be traded, and there's going to be a market in it, and there will be some price that is determined by demand and supply in this market. So you have, on the demand side, obviously all of these factories, they want to buy these allowances because they want to produce, for example, steel that's going to emit, so they have a certain demand for, they want to buy these allowances, so they're allowed to emit carbon. And on the seller side, it's basically, in first order, it's the government itself. They say, oh, I have hereby created, with a wooden hammer, 1 million allowances. And okay, then the government did that, and now they can go sell it to companies that want to buy these allowances. That's an auction in itself. It's an auction. They say, okay, hey, we have 1 million allowances this year. Who wants to buy them? Bid for the highest price, and then the highest bidder gets them, something like that. I'm simplifying. And then once you've bought an allowance, but it turns out you don't need it, you can also sell it to somebody else that turns out to need an extra allowance for an extra ton of carbon. And so there's also trade between market parties, like between factories that produce things and each emit. And so there's also trade in that sense. They buy from the auction from the government every year, and they trade amongst each other. And this system is sort of elegant in its design, but it didn't really quite work. There were basically way too much allowances for many years. Basically, the government dumped such large volumes of allowances into this system every year in the first, let's say, 10-ish years of this system existing, that the result was that the prices were super low. And basically, okay, it was functioning, it was operational. If you emitted 1 ton of carbon with your factory, you had to submit the allowance, and that's okay, it was operational in that sense. But since the prices were so low, it wasn't really making much of a difference at all. And it didn't hurt companies in that sense, in the financial sense, to be emitting, because they hardly had to pay anything for the emissions that they were causing. But that changed throughout the course of a few years. from the year 2022 onwards, the price of emitting 1 ton of CO2, so sort of the price that comes out of this market of emission trading allowances, has reached a sort of a new, much higher equilibrium, where on average in the years 2022, 3 and 4, it's about 80 euros per ton. So since a few years, we're really in Europe in a sort of a new reality, which is fundamentally different from before, which is that polluters, big factories emitting carbon, also gas plants, coal plants, whatever, all across Europe, the European Union, have to pay these sort of quantities for every ton they emit. And this is not a small amount. This hurts them. I mean, in the sense of they feel it. They can't ignore it. This is a big deal for them. Go ahead. Yeah. That's a super good question. I was just about to get to it. So obviously, why did this happen? Why did they increase so much these prices? Basically, what happened is when this system was initially designed, and now this is a bit of politics, you can imagine that the lobbyists from all the huge companies at the middle lot were very active in Brussels, and they tried their best to make sure that the system didn't hurt them financially, or at least as little as possible. And what they succeeded in the initial stage of doing, these lobbyists, was to say, okay, the amount of allowances that the government puts into the system every year is just way too high, basically. And that causes the market to have, as an outcome, super low prices. But this was basically corrected. It was corrected in several steps, and it's a very complicated story of exactly what they did and when. It has many technical jargony things in it. But long story short is, right now it's happening more and more, or since a few years it's happening more and more, that there are no more free allowances, because that used to be a thing that happened, that every huge company that the middle lot every year already, for starters, just got like some quantity of free allowances. And then for the remainder that they needed, they need to buy them and pay a price and trade with each other. Free allowances are basically over. So now they really need to buy every allowance that they need to submit. And on top of that, the amount of allowances made available by the public body every year has gone down a lot. And it now has this trajectory that every year the government, you could say, is going to create and sell through the annual auction a lower and lower amount of emissions allowances. So basically, like, less emissions are allowed, and cumulatively every year. And so every year this auction becomes a little more exciting, right? For these companies, same companies, if they don't change anything about the way they produce, and they use the same technologies and they produce the same quantities, they're going to emit the same. And if they do that, then every year there's the same demand for emission allowances, but the supply, how many of them there are available and are being sold in this competitive auction that the government organizes every year, the supply is going down. So Econ 101 suggests, of course, what's going to happen? Price is going to go up. The bidding process among the buyers is going to result, imagine the town square with buyers shouting, oh, I'm paying this much for an allowance. Oh, I'll pay even more for it. And this mechanism basically results in these prices going up in the emission trading system in Europe. And so it's not entirely clear what's going to happen, as with any sort of market-based price, what's going to happen to it in the future. I also can't predict what the NVIDIA stock will be or the Google or Facebook stock will be in 2 years' time. So nobody can say what the price of emission allowances will be in Europe in 2 or in 10 years' time. But, basically, if we stay the course that we're on right now and basically have these auctions every year with less and less and less allowances becoming available every year, the natural thing to expect would be that allowance prices are going to continue to increase and eventually be in the range of hundreds of euros per ton of CO2 emitted. And that starts to hurt so much that either as a company you definitely you're just like financially forced to switch to some technology that emits less or doesn't emit emissions at all. For example, producing steel in a new way that doesn't emit as much CO2. Or you say, okay, for some reason I feel like I'm unable to switch to another technology. So what I'll do instead is I'll just close my factory and I'll go produce my steel or whatever it is, or my cars in some other place, some other part of the world where they don't have the system and where I don't have to pay for emitting. So one of those two things is going to happen. Probably both of them are going to happen, each to a certain degree. We'll see some companies leave, we'll see others switching technologies and reducing their emissions. And let's hope that not too much of the first thing happens, because if we lose all industry in Europe, that will hurt us in terms of jobs and tax income and wealth in general, etc., etc. So to be seen, to be continued. I also don't know I don't have a glass ball either. What would you like to ask about it? Sorry.
Is there any third possibility of the markets going back to the initial phases if the lobbyists
Yes.
and you're putting more pressure
Yes.
on the government?
Super good point. So that's obviously one of the possible scenarios. If it starts hurting the big industrial players too much, and politicians become all over Europe more and more nervous that there's going to be huge job losses and companies leaving the continent, then it is very possible, even though they've put it in concrete, so to say, quite well at the European level. It's all in like very deep regulations. It's very deeply rooted in a way, legally speaking. You can't just change this system anymore from one day to the next. It's not that easy. But if the political pressure becomes high enough, it is nonetheless feasible that they will start meddling with it again. And they will say, whoa, 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 whoa. This reduction path of less and less allowances becoming available every year, we're going to adjust it a bit and maybe a bit looser so that we have a bit more allowances still, so that the prices become a bit more stabilized or don't rise as fast. So that's a possibility. And I think we already, I mean, I don't follow it up super closely, but we already see early signs of that basically, right? So that at least already some parts of the political spectrum at the European level are starting to say stuff in that direction. Like, are we going to hurt ourselves too much that we need to sort of adjust this again and make it less strict? So we'll see. We'll see what comes out of that. But on my final slide that I just want to show you today, going back to the day-ahead market for electricity, and I showed you the supply curve, which takes like these stairs, and the demand curve. What does this European emission trading system do that I was just talking about? It makes the production cost of each of the electricity production technologies that emit CO2 higher. So every coal plant and every gas plant, due to the emission trading system, now doesn't only have to pay for building a coal plant or a gas plant, big capital investment on day one, doesn't only have to pay for all the fuel, the coal and the gas itself, of course, which has a cost. It now also has to pay for CO2 emissions through this allowance system. And so what that does in the electricity market is it basically raises the price of those technologies. And as you can imagine, the point where the demand and the supply curves cross and where you end up clearing, and so what the outcome is of the day-ahead market, it's at a higher price. So obviously making gas plants and coal plants that produce electricity pay for their CO2 emissions, it on average has the effect that electricity becomes more expensive, right? At least during the hours when you need those technologies and you can't meet the demand with only renewables and nuclear. So in those hours, electricity becomes more expensive. And I will skip a bit here. And that's it. So I explained to you 3 things today: the amazing machine that our electricity system is. I explained the role of electricity, and we need to electrify a lot of stuff in the energy transition, right? But energy transitions are slow, so now we're going to do it fast. We'll see. And I explained like the whole chain of market mechanisms that we use nowadays to meet demand of electricity exactly in the right way every second of every day throughout the year. So I hope that was interesting to you. And that wraps up my class. So feel free to approach me if you have any questions or comments, or if whatever you want to ask or say. Or if you prefer, here's my email address if you want to do that digitally. Thank you.